find the notes for tonight. I hope I'm better prepared than I look. You will find out very soon. Quirinius, that's where we were. How can we forget Quirinius? Okay, we're through with, we recording now? We're through with Quirinius. That was kind of a side topic, I think, as we were looking at the Herodian line of leaders, and I said we still had to go through some of the Roman leaders that were not in the Herodian line until we come again to Agrippa the First and Agrippa the Second, some of the Agrippas to which we'll come in the future. Quirinius was kind of a footnote to that study, and I said after that we needed to get to some of the Roman leaders. So I think what we're supposed to be looking at this evening will be the Roman prefects or procurators, should be what we're on, the Roman prefects or procurators of Judea. Now, if I may, let me back up in time a little bit to our studies of some of the Herodian leaders, to go back to particularly Archelaus. Remember, Archelaus ruled from 4 BC to AD 6. He's the chief one of chief importance because of where he was ruler, and of course that was in the southern part of Palestine. This does tie in. I didn't mean by what I said earlier that the Quirinius question was irrelevant. It's certainly not irrelevant. It was something very worthwhile, I think, in our studying, chiefly, I guess I could say, because of the fact, as I've intimated before, it's the most important and most difficult technical Roman question with which we would have to deal in the New Testament. Moreover, it ties into the beginning of the procuratorship or the prefectship in Palestine and in Judea because of the so-called enrollment, the census, and then the taxation process that comes according to Acts chapter 5 and verse 37, evidently in the year AD 6. So let's kind of back up in our mind and just refresh our memory on that. We've dealt with 3 of Herod's descendants. We'll have more of his descendants with whom to deal in the future. Right now, just concentrate on Archelaus. He probably was the easiest one. He's the Matthew 2 individual. Easiest because he doesn't rule for very long. Both of the others rule for a long, long period of time. Archelaus is just a ruler from 4 BC to AD 6. Remember, according to Luke's Gospel, Jesus gives a parable that seems to be based, at least initially, upon some of the turmoil and some of the problems between Archelaus and his Jewish as well as his Samaritan subjects in Palestine and in Samaria. He finally does go to Rome in AD 6. This is another trip he makes to Rome. Of course, he was raised there, as were his brothers, and he's banished to Gaul. Whenever he's banished to Gaul, Rome steps in, okay, this becomes important, and converts Judea into what we're going to call an imperial province. Now, we're going to deal with provinces, I think, later on. I think my notes say that later on. We're going to deal with imperial versus senatorial provinces in the future, but we're not going to say much about that now except to say that Judea is converted into an imperial province. What had it been prior to this? Well, kind of a client kingdom is what it was. Herod the Great was a king. He was an independent king, but maybe we should put that in quotation marks. So he was independent in the sense that he controlled a territory not immediately and so directly controlled by Rome as is an imperial or a senatorial province. But of course, his whole appointment as king came from the Roman Senate, which makes him independent in quotation marks because Rome controlled him more or less as a puppet king. So Judea now passes into a new phase of her history. Therefore, new understanding has to come into our mind in order to properly interpret the New Testament, inasmuch as Judea goes from just a client kingdom to actually a province that's controlled by the Roman Empire. An imperial province means it falls directly under the jurisdiction, and therefore the taxation. Money, remember, is always important in all situations and circumstances of life. of the Roman emperor versus, of course, a senatorial province where jurisdiction would be handed to the Roman Senate. This is what, let's just kind of refresh our memory also about Quirinius and the two episodes we have. Luke chapter 2 and verse 2, along with Acts chapter 5 and verse 7, if you'll turn to those two places. Because it's the latter of these that brings about this date we're talking about, AD 6, with the events that transpire here. Luke chapter 2 and verse 2. Well, I'll start, of course, with verse 1 so we get the context here. It came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be enrolled. It's a census being taken. That's probably what the NIV has, but enrolled, really spelled with an E, would be fine, as we have provided in the KJV margin. That all the world should be enrolled. Now remember, this was one of the problems with which we had to earlier deal. Is that possible? Is that a historical fact that a census would ever go out in the Roman Empire for the whole world, that is, for the whole Roman world? Well, certainly true. We know that to be true. But we also know it to be true that whenever a worldwide, and by that we mean a Roman Empire-wide census was enacted, it was taken step by step, province by province, territory by territory, east to west, north to south, or something like that. So that not everything is going to come under the self-same date as far as the initiation of the census is concerned. This enrollment was first made when Cyrenius, and the Latin name is Quirinius, was governor of Syria, and he's better known by his Latin name Quirinius and his Greek name Cyrenius. And so I don't guess we need to go into all of that again. We spent a lot of time, 3 or 4 or so messages on that, but I think we've come to, well, basic conclusions, not foregone conclusions, not bygone conclusions, but basic conclusions as far as what really is taking place here according to Luke's gospel. And all went to be enrolled, everyone into his own city. That seems to be supported by some of the papyri which has been discovered in Egypt that dates a certain census there where they had to go to their ancestral home and not to the place of their current location. And Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea, into the city of David, which is called Bethlehem. Seems like there's an echo in here. I don't know if I just haven't heard myself teach here in a long time or what it is, or a southern accent I picked up. Something sounds funny. Because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be enrolled with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. We know how great she was because they didn't make it back home till the water broke and the child came. To just tell you how it really was. Then if you'll turn over to Acts chapter 5, and I don't mean anything, of course, sacrilegious there, but that's the way that it happened. It was a perfectly natural, perfectly supernatural birth. Acts 5 and verse 37. Now, according to Acts 1 and verse 1, the book of Acts is really no more than a continuation of the 24th chapter gospel of his. So that, well, it wouldn't be necessarily true that what we have here in Acts chapter 5, he would mean for us to understand this is not a repeat of what I've given you in Luke chapter 2 and verse 2. It could be. He could just be reiterating that. But we know that not to be true. What he's giving us here in Acts 5 and verse 37 is something entirely different than what we have back with Quirinius. This man rose up. After this man rose up, Judas of Galilee. Notice he's from the same place Jesus was from, Galilee. In the days of the taxing. Now this is specifically a taxing here. Not just a period of enrollment, not just a census. This is when the taxing takes place. Remember how we discussed earlier? People say, the critics say, well, people only revolt over the new and the novel. And if we have a census and a taxation period taking place way back here under Quirinius, 4 BC or 8 BC or 6 BC or whenever it is supposed to be, then why do we have a revolt here with Judas of Galilee in AD 6? Well, the simple solution to that, which is right before everyone's nose, is the fact that according to Luke 2, no taxation was involved there, just an enrollment. It was a head count is what it was. And you do that in the process of, and really in preparation of, the actual taxing of the people. And it's the money that concerns people, not their names being written down in some register somewhere, but it's the money that concerns them. So in AD 6, that's why I said a long time ago, whenever we came back to this date, you'd have to remember how long Archelaus had ruled, from 4 BC to AD 6. Whenever he is deposed to Gaul, then we have something important take place here. Rome steps in. They see this as a prime opportunity to take over southern Palestine. Why southern? Well, that's where the leader was formerly from, not from the north or from the east. Southern Palestine, and more to the point, because Jerusalem is there, and Jerusalem is the city, according to Nehemiah and Ezra, that rebellious city we talked about earlier, that needs to be controlled in order to control Palestine. So this all happens in AD 6, and drew away much people after him. He also perished, and all, even as many as obeyed him, were dispersed. So he gives us a case of one Theudas that we're really not that familiar with. We don't know the historical background of verse 36, Theudas. We do know something about Judas of Galilee. Luke A gives us something. Josephus B gives us some more and more detailed information about it. And it just so happens that it fits in perfectly with our point of reference and our point in time here as AD 6. Now, Jesus evidently went up to the temple around AD 6, AD 7, perhaps AD 7 would be a best date. So it's interesting that Judas rises up perhaps just prior to Jesus and his trip down to the temple. We've talked a little bit about his trip when he was 12 to the temple in Jerusalem earlier. Now, what takes place whenever Rome converts Judea into an imperial province is that she has to have direct military control of the territory. I mean, you think of the way we operate as the United States, when there's a territory we're wanting to control besides Missouri, you know. I mean, when it's overseas or something, what do you have there? What do we still have in West Germany? What do we still have in Korea there? We have troops that are stationed there, American troops that are stationed there, and may forevermore be stationed there. They're stationed there. They keep the peace. They're there in case something arises. Well, that's exactly what's going to take place as far as the Roman order is concerned. So that brings us into a very important subject. That's the subject of the prefects, or the procurators of Judea. Now, I probably will refer to them by both names. What's the correct name for our date and time right here, AD 6? Prefects. Prefects come first, as far as we know, because of an inscription found at Caesarea in 1961. The inscription reads, Pontius Pilate, Prefect of Judea. I'll bring a slide of that hopefully later on. Pontius Pilate, Prefect of Judea. Tacitus, who's writing several decades after this time, although we're talking about the 1st century A.D., and his writings refers to him as follows: Pontius Pilate, Procurator of Judea. And so there's always been a dispute, what was the correct title for the time of Pontius Pilate, who was 26 to 36 A.D., or let's just say A.D. 6, whenever the prefects or the procurators, whichever we choose, began in Judea. Which was the correct title? Tacitus refers to him as a procurator. Well, Tacitus has been known to be wrong in his descriptions when it comes to a technical description of someone, even though it's someone that doesn't antedate him by that many score, that many dozen years. Moreover, Tacitus could not be relied upon as much as a stone inscription when we can date the stone inscription all the way to the time of Pontius Pilate, because whoever was living at that time would have inscribed it, and he would have known of what he had reference. And we're talking with Tacitus someone many years later, several score years later. So we're going to stay with prefects. You'll find differences of opinion on that, but I'm basing that, my opinion here, upon the inscription that has been discovered, that I've seen in Caesarea, that was discovered in 1961. And it wasn't made in 1840, that's my point. It was made during the time of Pontius Pilate and refers to him as a prefect and not as a procurator. So probably procurator is a later term, maybe the second half of the 1st century A.D. would be when procurator was in vogue, and prefect the first 50 years of the 1st century A.D. The prefects were drawn from the equestrian order, which was the second rank in Roman society. Formerly, of course, horsemen. So these men were not natives. They were not indigenous to Palestine, to Idumea, as was Herod to Samaria, as was Herod and Herod's descendants. We're talking about Roman men then. We're not talking about half Jews, half Edomites, Idumeans. We're not talking about Jews. We're not talking about Greeks. We're talking about Roman men, Roman citizens from Roman society drawn from the second order of Roman culture, and that's known as the equestrian, E-Q-U-E-S-T-R-I-A-N, equestrian order. So there's a big distinction now. And I'm saying that because as we study these men, some of these men, of course, we have already studied, like Herod Antipas and Archelaus and Philip and Lysanias and these others. When we study these men, we have to kind of know from what background they are. I mean, Herod, here he is indigenous to that country. His father Antipater was an Idumean. His father Antipater had been the shadowy figure behind Jewish politics for so many years. You know, you're born, you're raised in that environment. You're accustomed to the Jews. You're accustomed to the Jewish people. Pontius Pilate, and I just use his name. We're going to discuss many different prefects or procurators. We'll probably major on him because he's best known. He occurs so often in the Gospels, and we have information of him outside the Gospels as well. Pontius Pilate, though, fits in another class. He comes from Rome. He's not a Jew. He's not a Samaritan. He's not an Idumean. He's a Roman citizen. So they're not going to understand the culture and the environment there as would someone else. They held independent military and political command at a post in Caesarea. Moved there whenever Rome takes over Judea and converts it to an imperial province in AD 6. Prior to that, Archelaus would have been at Jerusalem. Archelaus, remember, is a descendant of Herod the Great. So he's part Samaritan, not really Jewish, but part Samaritan and part Idumean. A palace, you've seen some of this on the slides now that we've shown you before. A palace and really a whole city was built by Herod the Great, BC years, at what we call Caesarea on the Sea, to distinguish it from Caesarea Philippi. So this prefect was from Rome, a Roman citizen. Generally, I think we might have maybe one exception. Felix or Festus, one of those two, I think, came from a different order, but generally taken from the second rank in Roman society, the equestrian order, who held independent military and political command. I mean, he was subject to Caesar, there's no doubt about that, but he's not subject to anyone else in Palestine. That's what I mean by independent. He's not subject, in other words, to Herod Antipas, who would still be around in these early years up north. And I guess most important thing to know about them is to remember that they're stationed at Caesarea and not at Jerusalem. Now here's what's a little odd and a little interesting about this. Here Jerusalem is the most important city, the most important place in Palestine. We've got a Herod Antipas who's stationed at Tiberias up on the Sea of Galilee. We have a Herod Philip. We have a Lysanias who are up in Trachonitis and Abilene and up in this area. We have these people. Then we have a Pontius Pilate or some of these other men who are in control of Samaria and Judea and Idumea, but who don't control from Jerusalem, rather from Caesarea. What's interesting about that? Jerusalem almost has no control then. There is no set political leader in Jerusalem throughout the whole time of Jesus' life. I'm talking about his ministry life. Of course, there was back in his early days, but he wasn't there. He was up in Galilee anyway. There's no set leader. There's no set political leader. What there is, however, is the highest religious court in Judaism of that day, of course known as the Sanhedrin. We will discuss a lot of the Sanhedrin and the various Jewish religious sects that also arose between the Testaments later on. So what we have then is an incredibly religiously imbued society here in Jerusalem. I mean, politics are mixed into it because politics and religion always go hand in hand. But we don't have an official Roman or an official Herodian leader who is in control of Jerusalem. Nothing really here. We've got Roman soldiers who are here, and we'll discuss that momentarily. But they're under the jurisdiction of a captain there who's under the jurisdiction of the ultimate leader, the ultimate Roman leader in southern Palestine, or in all of Palestine for that matter, and that would be the prefect or the procurator back at Caesarea on the sea or on the Mediterranean. He was subject to the governing official of Syria. The province of Judea was a subject province under the province of Syria. Syria was an older province, and I guess we could say Syria was a more important province as far as the Romans were concerned. Not for us. We're more concerned with Palestine and Judea. But Syria, from the Roman point of view, was a more important piece of territory. Now, what was the name of the leader, the official name of the leader up in Syria? We've been discussing that before. Quirinius, okay, what was he? Prefect? No, that's only down in Palestine. How about a legate? You remember that term? Okay, he was a legate. So the prefects were under the jurisdiction of the legates. The prefects of Judea were under the jurisdiction of the legates of Syria. L-E-G-A-T-E-S, the legates. You remember that now, don't you? Okay, it's just been 2 weeks. Let's look at some of the duties of the prefects or the procurator in Judea. I think that will give us a better understanding of what's going on in the New Testament. How we are to look upon these men. What could they do? Where is Pontius Pilate practicing something illegal? We're going to have a list of about, a dozen to 14 prefects or procurators. Most of these I don't think you'll be familiar with. You'll be familiar with Pilate, Felix, and Festus. Those will probably be the only ones you're familiar with. Probably the ones that most people, if they're familiar with anything, are familiar with Pontius Pilate chiefly, and maybe behind him, if they've read the book of Acts, they're familiar with Felix and Festus. Felix and Festus also fit in this same category. What actually did they do, or more to the point, what could they do? What were they allowed? What were their duties as far as the control of this imperial province that was under the direct jurisdiction of the Caesar of Rome? Well, let's look at a few things here. First of all, it was their duty, and you'll see how this comes into play. Most, if not all of these things, comes into play immediately in the gospel narratives. First of all, they had the right and the responsibility to collect taxes. Now, this was not the same thing as the tax of Acts 5:37. Now, we may have to, I think we probably will have to look at taxes more in the future. There are many different types of tax. There are poll tax, head tax, grain tax. There's this worldwide, Roman Empire-wide tax of AD 6, which really goes into effect just this one time as far really as Palestine is concerned, as far as our period of time in Palestine is concerned, because it's the beginning of a new era in Judea, whenever the Roman government takes them over directly as an imperial province. But you remember over in the gospel narratives the question of taxation that came up on several occasions. If you'll turn with me, for instance, back in Matthew's gospel, you'll find it several times here. I'm thinking also of Romans. You remember Romans chapter 13 speaks of this. You'll find it several different times. Let's look more to the point at Matthew 22. At Matthew 22. Now, what's the date for Matthew 22, someone out there? What year is this taking place? Just approximate. 30. Okay, 30 is fine. 25 to 30, let's say. Let's just say 30. This is taking place in 30. Okay, and here's what they say, verse 15. Then went the Pharisees and took counsel how they might entangle him in his talk. They sent out unto him their disciples with the Herodians, saying, Master, we know you're true and you teach the way of God in truth. You don't care for any man. That is, you don't show partiality for anyone. Tell us, therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not? Who's Caesar at this time? Tiberius? Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not? Who was Caesar whenever the AD 6 tax was enacted? Augustus Caesar. Okay, so we're talking about a different man here, so we must be talking about a different question. I'm sure it has its origin with the first taxation that the Jews had experienced under the Romans in AD 6. But look what happens as we move along, though. Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, Why tempt ye me, ye hypocrites? Show me the tribute money. And they brought unto him a penny. He saith unto them, Whose is this image and superscription? And they say unto him, Caesar's. Then saith he unto them, Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things which are God's. Now what do they ask him? Verse 17, is it lawful to give tribute? And then he asks in verse 19, show me the tribute money. Okay, you see that in the end of verse 19, and they bring him a penny. And then verse 20, whose is this image and superscription? Okay, and then if you'll hold your finger there maybe and turn back to chapter 17. I'm sure we're going to have to discuss this taxing business because it becomes very complicated with the terms that are used in the Greek New Testament and with what is meant by the terms that appear in the New Testament. Chapter 17, beginning with verse 24. When they were come to Capernaum, they that received the tribute, and they have money italicized here, and they have in the margin called in the original the didrachma, being in value 15 pence. Of course, that depends on when you write the margin, whether it's worth 15 pence or inflation runs it up to 2,000 pence. It's totally irrelevant to have things like that in the Bible. We've discussed that with Bible translations as far as this money business is concerned. So we have an entirely different word over here. We'll bring this out more in the future, so don't be too concerned if you're not catching it all, but we have an entirely different word, therefore an entirely different question here. Entirely different. It has nothing to do with Rome. It has nothing to do with Caesar. It has nothing to do with tribute money, although that's how it's rendered here. Came to Peter and said, doth not your master pay tribute? Same problem there with that term. And he didn't have much of an answer except just to say yes. And then he wanted to go and find out some more about it. And when he was coming to the house, Jesus prevented him, saying, what thinkest thou, Simon? Or we might say, what do you think, Simon? Of whom do the kings of the earth take custom or tribute? Now we're to some different terms here. Of their own children or of strangers? And Peter saith unto him, of strangers. And Jesus saith unto him, then are the children free. Well, now what's he talking about here? People, this is a question, not a statement, people who are not Roman citizens, and therefore they would be considered strangers, but the children shouldn't have to pay. But yet Jesus' implication here is that we are children. And yet were they counted officially citizens of the Roman Empire? Remember, Paul counted that, and so did the man beating him over there in the book of Acts as of great value to be a Roman citizen. He said he obtained it with much money. Paul said, I was freeborn. Notwithstanding, lest we should offend them, go to the sea and cast a hook and take up the fish that first cometh up. This is what you call a good fishing trip here. I've been on a few. I didn't snag any like this one, though. When thou hast opened his mouth, thou shalt find a piece of money. And let's give ourselves that good marginal reading. You'll find a stater. It is half an ounce of silver, and gives us the shillings and pence it's worth. Take that and go pay for you and me. And then if you'll turn over to the book of Romans, chapter 13. We're talking about the first duty of the prefects was the duty to collect taxes. Romans 13. Familiar passage in verse 7. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. So if nothing else, what we're doing for you now is introducing you to some of these passages at which we will later return and look more in detail and come to some understanding of what these tribute, custom, didrachma, stater terms really mean. In other words, who is the person collecting the taxes? Is it a religious tax, a spiritual tax, a Jewish tax, or is it a Roman tax? If it's a Roman tax, is it a head tax? Is it a bridge tax? Is it some type of grain tax, an animal tax? They had taxing problems then like we have today. Another duty was the right of judicial governing. First of all, is to collect taxes. So I'll have to apply this in your own mind to Pontius Pilate, to Felix and Festus, since those are the three men with whom you're familiar at this time. Pontius Pilate, Felix, and Festus. They had the right to collect taxes in Judea. They had the right of judicial governing. They could appoint and remove high priests. We're still under the second point here. They could appoint and remove high priests at will. And they exercised that option of theirs. Capital offenses had to be decided by them, and any punishment, which if it's a capital offense means the punishment's execution, carried out by them. Carried out by them and carried out only by them. And let's see, I don't have a lot down there. I've got it somewhere. I remember it in my mind. We probably will look at that more in the future as well. But what happens, by the way, let me just say this, because we're not going to be able to study this in much detail because of that fact, and that is it's very detailed. The Passion narrative, what goes on, well, the last week of Jesus' life, and more specifically, the last night of his life. What takes place in what order? You know, it seems like there's a trial here, and it seems like there's one during the night, because isn't Peter warming his hands by some charcoal somewhere, and the cock crows, so that must be during the nighttime. And I thought people slept at night, and I thought, according to Jewish law, it's illegal to have a trial at night. You have to have a trial in the daytime, and so it seems like they're reconvening in the morning, and at one time it's with Annas, and another time it's with Caiaphas, and then they say, now let's all get together, and then let's take him over to Pontius Pilate. And then what's Pilate doing down in Jerusalem at this time, Passover time? Well, you've already guessed that before. So you have all these trials going on. Judicial governing, the power of judicial governing, it's a very, very intricate network of systems that are taking place here. A Jewish system, a Roman system, whose rights are being violated, who is doing the violating of someone else's rights, what's legal, what's illegal. Then you get the whole picture now. If Jesus is up all night, he's had this long drawn-out thing the night before, this last night early in the evening with the Last Supper and the foot washing and the prediction of the betrayer who leaves the table and to go to the garden. You have all of this teaching in John chapters 14, 15, 16, and the prayer in John 17. Over to the Garden of Gethsemane. He's captured over there, trials during the night, scourging during the night, scourging the next day, another trial then, finally put on the cross. It's a wonder that he lived as long as he did. He had gone all those hours without sleep that a lot of people don't recognize. They think, well, he slept 8 hours before he was crucified. No, he didn't. There was no sleep the night before. He was on trial the whole time. Well, of course, the religious leaders are up the whole time. And what happens when you stay up too many hours? You get irritable, and you get irritated about various things. Well, they're in no mood to deal with the next day, that's for sure. And what do? Whenever Pontius Pilate says, this is an innocent man, and I told you before, he uses the technical terms, the man is acquitted, he is an innocent man. And that should have been final sentence there. High priests stir the people up. And you have a mob revolt on your hands here. And then they say, well, if any man's a friend with this man, he's not a friend of Caesar's, inasmuch as this man's claiming to be king, and there is no king but Caesar. And so they put all of this on Pilate. And so it's just a long, drawn-out affair. But what happens whenever they finally come to their conclusions, whenever they ask Jesus certain questions, and to certain people he gives answers, and to others he does not? But the high priest, they ask, are you the Son of God? And he said, you've said that I am. He said, from henceforth you'll see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. While the high priest rent his robe and said, blasphemy! What need we of any other charge against this man? Blasphemy. Well, blasphemy, according to Mosaic law, what was the sentence for that? Death. Why did they kill him then? They couldn't. That had to be stamped officially by the Roman prefect and had to be carried out by him. So see, you have a big change in the period between the testaments, which is what we're talking about. The Jewish Old Testament said blasphemy, you execute the man. Of course, we wouldn't count what Jesus said blasphemy. He told the truth. He was God. And they would see the Son of Man coming. But they saw him as a man and only as a man. You as a man make yourself God. That equals blasphemy. And the penalty for that is death. Well, they don't carry it out. They violating the law? Well, now they have a new law over them, and that's the Roman law. And then with that in mind, I'm getting ahead of my story, but I get excited about all of these details in here. With that in mind, where are we going to turn now? You can't possibly, don't feel guilty now when you don't know what I'm talking about. You can't possibly know what I'm talking about. How about Acts chapter 7? Turn over to Acts 7. What happens in the end of Acts 7? Huh? Then someone gets stoned over there? So you see, this is interesting when you study this in light of what I've just discussed with you. Well, the longest chapter in the book of Acts here, 60 verses, preceded by the shortest chapter, chapter 6 with 15. Stephen's more or less on trial for his life. I'm way back in chapter 6 now, verse 13. This man ceaseth not to speak blasphemy. Blasphemous words against this holy place and the law. For we've heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth shall destroy this place and shall change the customs which Moses delivered us. And all that sat in the council, looking steadfastly on him, saw his face as it had been the face of an angel. Then said the high priest, are these things so? And he said, well, ladies and gentlemen, the God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham, on and on and on. Verse 51, ye stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears. You think that would help you win friends or influence people? Yeah. You stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears. You do always resist the Holy Spirit. As your fathers did, so do you. Which of the prophets have not your fathers persecuted? They've slain them which showed before the coming of the just one, of whom ye have now been the betrayers and murderers, who have received the law, and so forth. When they heard these things, they were cut to the heart. They gnashed on or at him with their teeth. And he, being full of the Holy Spirit, looked up steadfastly into heaven, and saw the glory of God, and Jesus standing on the right hand of God, and said, behold, I see the heavens opened, and the Son of Man standing on the right hand of God. Now, why would they be upset with that statement? What did the Old Testament say? No man can see God and live. And he said, I just saw him, and he lived to tell about it. So that's blasphemy then, to be able to say that. They cried out with a loud voice. See, so much Jewish law and Roman law and culture is interwoven into the narrative of the New Testament. And to understand those is to understand it. And stopped their ears and ran upon him with one accord and cast him out of the city and stoned him. Let's see, don't we need a 57th and a half verse in there somewhere? They cried out with a loud voice, stopped their ears, ran upon him with one accord, cast him out of the city, and stoned him. Where's the trial? The witnesses laid down their clothes at a young man's feet whose name was Saul. They stoned Stephen. Kneeled down, and he cried with a loud voice, don't lay this sin to their charge. And when he had said this, then he fell asleep. Well, that's, you see, interesting. We'll have to, of course, return to all of this. The right of judicial governing. But we're going to stay with our statement because that can be backed up from a statement over in the Gospels as well as extra biblical material. That the stamp of approval for capital punishment was at the discretion of the Roman prefect. You'll chiefly see the judicial arm of the prefect in the New Testament in the trials of Jesus and the Apostle Paul. Stephen here, of course, we don't see them entering in here. It's just a Jewish situation here. But we chiefly see the prefects in their judicial governing power, and we chiefly see them, period, in the trials of Jesus and the Apostle Paul. I mean, how often do you see them? How much material is really taken up with the subject of taxation in the Gospels or in the book of Acts? How many chapters do we have toward the end of the book of Acts that's taken up with Felix and Festus in this situation? How many chapters in the end of the four Gospels are taken up with Pontius Pilate and the trial of Jesus? So what I'm saying is the chief thing that they are known for, the prefects in the New Testament, would be not taxation, would not be this third thing that we're going to come to here in a moment, but the second point here, and that is their outstretched judicial arm. That's chiefly how they're seen in the New Testament. Now that doesn't mean that's the most important thing they did. That's what appears in the New Testament, obviously, because of the circumstances. The trials of Jesus and Paul would be of critical importance. Okay, a third duty. This will take us a little more time because it's going to bring us into another subject that we might as well discuss in its entirety here. That is, they had the right to command military forces. Okay, so we've seen collect taxes, the right of judicial governing, and the right to command military forces. A garrison of soldiers would be stationed with the prefect at Caesarea. Probably several others nearby. Another in Jerusalem under a chief captain. Now, I think it's in mentioning this that we will probably find our best juncture here in this study to discuss Roman forces in Palestine. So let's get a little technical again. Not that we haven't been already, but let's get a little technical again and try to thoroughly deal with the subject of Roman forces in Palestine in the first half of the 1st century A.D. Now they had a hierarchy of structure, just like I guess you'll find in practically every army, in the Roman army, that was spread throughout the world, where we're going to start with the top division and work our way downwardly. That means we'll start with what's known as the legion. Legion. Roman, not American. The legion. Originally, this is a little shady. I'll give you what I had discovered about this. Originally, the legion may have had as many as 3,000 soldiers, or I guess I should say as few as 3,000 soldiers. But it probably eventually grew to 6,000 men, and that's the general figure that you'll find, and that's probably a figure that's current with the first half of the 1st century A.D. In other words, the legion. What does a legion mean to us? It means nothing at all to us. What was a legion? A legion was 3,000 men, probably back in its earliest days whenever it was employed by the Roman army. What is that? What does that mean by the time we open the pages of the New Testament? Probably 6,000 men. And it didn't grow to be any larger in number than this. 6,000 was the limit, and probably 6,000 was the norm for the period with which we are dealing. There were 25 legions in all in the Roman Empire. 25 legions. Now, that doesn't just mean you can multiply 25 by 6 and end up with 6,000, the number of Roman soldiers, because there were other classifications, such as the horsemen, and there were sailors. It's been estimated that there were probably, counting all the classes of Roman forces, there were probably, and this may sound like a lot, but on the other hand, I guess to me it sounds rather small, there were probably 340,000 men in the Roman army, which includes these legions, 25 legions. There were probably 340,000 soldiers in the Roman army. 25 legions in this group spread throughout the Roman Empire, from Gaul all the way to Syria, from North Italy to North Africa. In the 1st century A.D., there were perhaps 3 or 4 legions in Syria. So we're talking maybe 20,000 soldiers of the legion class in Syria, 20,000 soldiers in Syria.
For the continuation